There's new evidence that a Chinese truck builder, partly owned by a Volkswagen subsidiary, has done business with the military in Myanmar, which is accused of human rights abuses and sanctioned by the EU. Now, that's the claim of a recent report out of the U.S. And if it sounds confusing, I'm joined now by the author, Savanna Slaughter. The report is titled Faulty Transmission, and she's an analyst at nonprofit investigator C4ADS, and she's going to help us understand what this report is about and what she's found. We'll begin with a simple question. Hopefully you can keep it as briefly as possible, Savanna, because we're going to get into the details in just a moment. How would you describe the main takeaway from your report?
Given that this report is a follow-up to previous reporting that the Deutsche Welle and Justice for Myanmar has done on the topic, I think this big takeaway from this report is highlighting how important it is to follow up and hold businesses accountable for their statements and actions, because it's really easy to make claims that you're no longer doing business with the military, especially in Myanmar. But whether or not that's actually the case needs to be closely monitored and tracked, because it's really just that easy for businesses to lie about their practices. And it's incredibly important that more people work to hold businesses to their word.
Okay, before we get into the details, let's look at the background. C4ADS combs through export and import data to draw a picture of trade relations, often focusing on sanctioned goods. Now, in this case, we're talking about trade going into Myanmar, where a military-based junta has been trying to finish the coup d'etat that it began in 2021 and defeat a tenacious opposition force. Now, the UN Security Council has censured the military junta, while the EU and US have sanctioned business with it. In 2021, as Savanna mentioned, German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung revealed that trucks from Chinese company Sinotruk were being used by the junta in its operations. The publicly listed subsidiary of that company is owned partly by Traton. That is a Volkswagen subsidiary. Traton later told the newspaper that Sinotruk had confirmed it had never sent trucks to the military in Myanmar, and that it had in fact suspended all operations in Myanmar. And that's where we pick up today, and hopefully we're going to explain all this a little bit better in the following interview, the following minutes. Savanna, let's start by talking about Sinotruk. How would you describe it as a company, and how does it relate to this Volkswagen subsidiary, Traton?
Of course. So Sinotruk is a state-owned Chinese truck manufacturing company that produces heavy-duty trucks and ships them across the world. And it has a number of subsidiaries, including a number of which we'll look at today. Sinotruk Import and Export Company ships and exports Sinotruk parts and vehicles, and then Sinotruk Hong Kong, which is who Traton is a minor investor in, is a 51% owned subsidiary of Sinotruk that is publicly listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And Traton owns 25% plus one shares of Sinotruk Hong Kong. And what's important about that is under German law, having that extra plus one share makes Traton a blocking minority shareholder and therefore can block decisions taken by the company.
Okay, that is important. 25% plus one share means that you have that blocking minority. Let's talk about the trucks. How is the military using these trucks? How do we know that they're using them?
So this was one of the big major things that the 2021 report covered, is that I believe the words they used was it's the logistical backbone of the Myanmar military in terms of their ability to move troops across the country. And so in that report, they covered that Sinotruk vehicles were spotted at a number of major protest sites. In the background, the pictures of the wounded and the dead, transporting troops carrying slingshots and guns to the sites to massacre innocent civilians, but then also transporting detained protesters. So this report kind of outlined an initial usage of the trucks in the early days of the coup. And then our report continues to expand on that, looking at the usage of Sinotruk vehicles in the actual military operations. And what we've seen based on military seizure blogs is that a number of resistance forces, particularly in Karenni State, have seized Sinotruk vehicles, which indicates that they're being utilized in armed conflict, continuing to transport troops to the field, which means that they've gone beyond just protest sites to armed conflict. So they continue to be a major vehicle and major point of usage for the Myanmar military.
So that was a lot of that was the 2021 report, which established the use of those trucks in Myanmar, how they're being used, for example. Your report tries to go a step further by showing those trade relationships. It really hinges, if I'm right, primarily on human sourcing, but also trade data. Could you tell us a little bit about both of those sources?
Of course. So, as a brief overview of the difference between our report and the previous reporting, while the previous report shows the usage of Sinotruk vehicles by the Myanmar military, that doesn't actually prove or establish a trade relationship between Sinotruk and the Myanmar military. While it's decent circumstantial evidence, one could come up with half a dozen variously plausible ways that the Myanmar military could have procured the trucks without Sinotruk knowing. And as you mentioned, when Stratton and Sinotruk replied to this article, they claimed that Sinotruk had never done business with the Myanmar military and suspended all business operations in Myanmar. When we acquire trade data is typically collected by trade data aggregator platforms, which are available for purchase, and you can search by importer or exporter or HS code or a number of different factors that will allow you to identify trade records you're looking for. Unfortunately, China and Myanmar trade is typically underrepresented due to both countries being less open about publicly available information than other jurisdictions, but we got lucky in that we were able to find direct import-export records from Sinotruk Import and Export to two different offices of the Myanmar military, the Directorate of Procurement and the Office of the Chief of Defense Industries, which I will refer to as OCDI throughout the rest of this discussion, but both of which are sanctioned by the US and the EU. So these are major military offices, and we have the direct import-export record showing that Sinotruk is in fact doing business with the Myanmar military, both before they made that statement publicly and after they made that statement publicly. And this is something that I think is so critical, as I mentioned, for exposing the truth when companies can just lie about their business operations. But the other important thing about this was cross-corroborating it with human sourcing that our colleagues at Justice for Myanmar were able to identify. And we can get much more into details about the manufacturing process and the shipment process in the country, but essentially what human sourcing was able to find matched our import-export records, and that completed Sinotruk vehicles and parts for maintenance and repair were going to the Directorate of Procurement. And then complete knockdown kits, which are unassembled parts that are typically manufactured in the country upon arrival, are sent to OCDI. And so this matched with what we were seeing in the import-export records, where truck parts for maintenance were being shipped to the Directorate of Procurement, whereas CKD kits, the complete knockdown kits, were going to OCDI.
And so you would say that the authentication of this trade data comes through the human sourcing, because I imagine some of our viewers would want to know if this is a kind of illicit or not looked upon lightly kind of trade that's going on here. Why would these records be available? How do you ascertain that this trade data is legitimate? Is it primarily through the human sourcing?
I think that's an incredibly important component of it. If we weren't able to cross-validate it the way we did, I think it would hold a little bit less weight. Although that being said, given that these trade records are so hard to find, a number of trade records for jurisdictions that are hard to access come from leaks. So that the fact that it's illicit doesn't necessarily indicate that the records would be scrubbed from existence when, people on the sending and receiving end might not have reason to suspect that this would ever be made public. So I think between the two, it's fairly compelling when you're able to combine both human sourcing and trade data. And then that's really important for establishing the manufacturing process, which we can discuss more, but essentially what's really important that we also discovered in this report is that these complete knockdown kits that are assembled in Myanmar are actually mill trucks when they're produced and sent out into the field. They're not branded Sinotrucks like the complete vehicles when they're shipped to Myanmar, which means that actually beyond just the Sinotrucks that are operating in the field, there's mill trucks operating in the field as well, which are also linked back to Sinotruk and Stratton, which expands the remit of responsibility that they have and also indicates a much broader scope of Sinotruk and Chinese technology in the manufacturing process as well.
When we look at this trade data, how complete is it? What kind of time period is it covering?
Yes, so the trade data records for shipments from Sinotruk stop in March 2022. It's hard to ascertain, like I said, with the lack of availability of China-Myanmar trade records, whether this is an actual cessation of shipments on Sinotruk's end, or if we're just only seeing a small fraction of the picture, or if, like you said, they've started obscuring trade records, which is fairly easy to do if you just strike your name from trade records. So the records start from before the coup. After the coup, about May, they pick up again, and then through around March 2022 is when we have direct confirmation of the shipments.
And can we say or not whether this kind of trade is continuing today then? I guess through the trade data we cannot. Does the human sourcing tell you anything about what's still happening right now?
The human sourcing hasn't indicated any direct evidence or further. I'm not sure when the exact time frame of the last contact Justice for Myanmar was able to make with the human sourcing, but given that it is incredibly dangerous to serve as a human source for this type of report testifying on the junta's factories, given that this production happens under Tatmadaw heavy industries, under the direct oversight of Min Aung Hlaing and the State Administrative Council, it's incredibly dangerous to be providing this type of information. Although I think with what we've seen from long-term investment from Sinotruk in the country, their investment in the military manufacturing process, sending representatives to Tatmadaw heavy industries to make sure that they can meet the needs of the junta, I would say it's a strong likelihood that business is continuing, especially since there has been no other follow-up asking that they stop. But it's impossible to confirm.
And just to clarify, Justice for Myanmar is the group that you were working with for a lot of the human sourcing in particular. Is that correct?
Yes, so we co-wrote the report with Justice for Myanmar, and they've contributed both strong degrees of contextual knowledge, human sourcing, and they were able to pull the import-export records from a different provider as well that corroborated the data that we had. So we've tried to check it across as many different sources as possible, and they've been invaluable assets across the other methodologies we've included in the report, including just media coverage, leaked documents, other open source contracts we've been able to find. All of that was conducted jointly, and cannot say enough good things about their work and their contributions to the report.
So just to be clear, we don't have these trade records saying that this has happened up through 2024. Why is it so important that we have them through 2022? What does this time period tell us? You've already alluded to this a little bit, but what does it mean in relation to that original report as well?
That's a wonderful question. So that major response letter that Justice for Myanmar and other civil society organizations received from Stratton was sent in September 2021, which is the date in which Sinotruk claimed that they had never done business with the Myanmar military and they had ceased all business in Myanmar. Given that these shipments occurred after that statement was released, it indicates that they had been lying about ceasing their business operations in Myanmar, and therefore puts any additional statements they may make now or in the future into doubt based on their now track record of lying about relationships with the Myanmar military. But I think the other thing that's important about that is that gives you about a 6-month window of confirmed ongoing activity post that date. And Stratton claimed that they would be exhausting all legal rights available to them as a blocking minority shareholder to investigate and confirm that Sinotruk was telling the truth. And if they had gone through with confirming their supply chain, theoretically, they would have been able to find what we found, which calls into doubt Stratton's actual willingness to comply with their human rights obligations as well.
Okay. And just to be clear, we've reached out to Stratton as well as Sinotruk. We've attempted reaching out to Sinotruk. At the time of this recording, we've received no response from either. If and when they respond, we will post it at the top of the comments with this video. You've mentioned several times, Savanna, how there's sort of an industrial know-how that goes with this. There is a sending of parts, according to these trade reports, knockdown parts. That means basically a disassembled vehicle, I would imagine, and then there has to be some sort of manufacturing process on the other side. So would that mean then that there is a kind of industrial capability that could then put these together, but then also repair and maintain these trucks provided by Sinotruk?
I think that that's something we've had major concerns about, and I think that's something that Justice for Myanmar, even going back to 2021, has had major concerns about. And that's something else that they called, and I would echo the call for Stratton to investigate whether or not there are any active licensing agreements, because given, like you said, the long-term manufacturing involvement from Sinotruk in the country, and we do know that there's active license agreements with one of their partner companies, another Chinese state-owned organization, Weichai. Weichai is a major engine producer who collaborated very closely with Sinotruk in the past. They have the same chairman. Both of those two companies have worked closely with Stratton. There's all sorts of media footage of, going back and forth between China and Germany, examining each other's factories and celebrating their close collaboration moving into the future. But when these complete knockdown kits arrive, they don't have engines according to human sourcing, and also what we can corroborate with the typical nature of complete knockdown kits. So when these parts are assembled in the Tatmadaw Heavy Industries factories, Weichai engines are also produced under license at these factories before being added to the Sinotruk vehicles that are branded mill truck once they go out in the field. So given that very close, Chinese partnership for Sinotruk has active license agreements in a similar way with long-term manufacturing investment in the country and for the Myanmar military, it's quite plausible that they might have ongoing license agreements and ways in order to, because like we said, the other shipments we saw were truck parts for maintenance of completed vehicles. And it's very plausible, therefore, that there is some sort of training or some sort of additional manufacturing capacity that is being incorporated. So while we were not able to identify explicitly any ongoing licensing agreements, we do encourage Stratton to do what they can as a blocking minority shareholder to ascertain this.
Is there any evidence that there was a direct relationship between Stratton and the Myanmar military?
No, I think it's mostly through Sinotruk, and I think this is going to be a major defense for Stratton, is that they're not seeing direct technological exports to the Myanmar military, and therefore they're not complicit in human rights and war crimes. This, however, is not a great defense by any means, especially if we look at the OECD responsible business guidelines, where if you're at any point in the value chain for products that are going to a military end user or committing human rights violations, you are responsible. And there's multiple ways that Stratton can be contributing beyond just direct exports. They've worked very closely with Sinotruk since their investment in 2009, cooperatively developing tools and technologies. And if you look at Sinotruk Hong Kong's website, they talk about the major advances in heavy truck arrays that they've been able to make based on the collaborative support of Stratton technology. So even if they're not directly exporting to the Myanmar military, their technology is very likely contributing. And perhaps even more importantly, whether or not they are directly exporting, they are directly profiting. When Sinotruk and Sinotruk Hong Kong make money off of selling to the Myanmar military, Stratton directly profits from that. And so to me, it's a lazy way out to claim a lack of responsibility just because you are not directly exporting, but you are directly profiting and have directly contributed to the technology that is supporting the Myanmar military.
We know at the same time that other companies have struggled with Myanmar since the coup about whether they should sever relations or not. Is this not a similar case of a company trying to decide its position?
I think you raise a good point where it has been a question of responsible business in Myanmar, whether or not companies can use their position to make a difference. I think that's something that we've seen with Adidas, where the workers who were wrongfully terminated from the Puchen factory were able to appeal to Adidas for help. However, I would say this is the crux of the issue. Stratton is not helping, nor are they pulling out. And I think that's why in our report, we call for them to do one or the other. They either need to be actively utilizing their investor power and calling for and conducting a proper investigation into this supply chain and using their power to block or influence decisions, or they need to pull out. You can't be doing neither. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Now, again, we have reached out to Troughton and are waiting for remarks or for a response to this report from them. And once we have that, we will post it on above the comments of this video. Savanna, just today, EU member states agreed to a new law forcing some companies to certify their supply chains against environmental and human rights abuses. This law has been in the works for some time now, and now it's faced that final hurdle. Based on your work here, how difficult would you say it is to enforce supply chain oversight, to enforce measures like these, which on some ends are being celebrated as providing transparency, much necessary transparency, but it comes down to enforcement? What can we say about that?
Enforcement is always the question for things like this. And I think this is why it's important to have as much of a Western touch point as we can in these situations in order to actually be able to apply pressure, because I don't know if any of us are optimistic enough to think we can influence a Chinese state-owned company's operations. Being said, I'm very curious to see what the enforcement action taken here is, or if anything at all. Well, I do think direct import and export is not the only way to be contributing to military end user. It's not necessarily, it's much more cut and dry in that case in terms of enforcement and prosecution. And I'm not a lawyer, so it's hard to say necessarily what this EU law is going to look like in terms of the specifics for investment or technological support. But that being said, I know something that the EU has been discussing and maybe in this set of laws is gaining contractual assurance from your partner to ensure that there's not human rights abuses at the end of transactions. And I find that curious because if in that case, for example, Sinotruk provided false contractual assurance, just as a hypothetical in the future, to Troughton about their business operations, would that give Western companies potential ability to, regain monetary damages if they had a partner who was lying to them? So I think that's a curious angle to take in order to cut down on just the ability to make blatantly false statements if you can be held legally responsible for false contractual assurances. But I do look forward to seeing how the EU laws ultimately play out for enforcement.
There is a lot more scrutiny on these supply chains. We know that in some cases, companies may not even know about second or third tier suppliers to suppliers, or at least they say they don't know. What is their responsibility? How do you draw lines? You mentioned that Troughton could, in theory, have this case or have a defense of saying this is a subsidiary of a partner. How far should you be able to look in and draw lines and say, this is something that I have control over? They might say they have no control.
Yes, so I think that's another set of defenses that are not particularly compelling out of Troughton. It is not like Sinotruk Hong Kong is a completely unrelated subsidiary. It is just the publicly traded Hong Kong branch of the major Chinese corporation. And in the original response letter from Troughton, they don't go out of their way to explicitly say, oh, we're only involved in Sinotruk Hong Kong. Sinotruk's activities don't concern us. They address it as Sinotruk Group as a whole, as if they recognize that they are a full partner of Sinotruk in and of itself. And so I think it's more important than ever to pay attention to Troughton's original words regarding this before they were confirmed to be involved in supplying the Myanmar military, because that is a big thing from the 2021 piece. Troughton was claiming, oh no, we've never heard about this. How could this possibly be the case? But now they were put on notice by both that article, the letters, people reaching out. And so you can't hide behind that defense anymore, which means they'll probably try to pivot to claiming less connection or back to the direct import-export line of reasoning. But they didn't go out of their way to separate themselves in that way previously when there was a lack of direct proof. So given the connection of how this corporation operates as a whole, I think it's not particularly compelling as a defense.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. That's Savanna Slaughter. She's author of the report Faulty Transmission, which looks at trade with Myanmar's military from a Chinese company that also has connections to Traton, a subsidiary of Volkswagen. Savanna, thank you very much. As she mentioned, she's with C4ADS. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you.